Hey everyone, this time we're going to be going over Game Over by David Sheff. So this is the 1999 edition. There are at least two others that I can find online, so uh, yeah, I don't think there's too much of a difference between them. This will obviously have a little bit more information because he goes over a little bit more. Yeah, I think they're all pretty much the same. I don't think you're missing anything if you read one of the earlier editions. In fact, some of the extra chapters in this don't really add anything to the story. It still goes over Nintendo's history. It still gives you all the stories that you probably heard in other places, but most of the time they're going to be citing Game Over here. It's a really good book. It's got a lot of stuff in there. If I had read this one first, or if I had read this 10 years ago, it probably would have been a much better book than what it was. So if you've watched other videos on like the how Tetris came to the US, the Universal lawsuit with Nintendo, that's all going to be in here. It's pretty good. I honestly think a lot of the videos that I've watched on those, they do a good job of recounting what David had written in here. And you can kind of tell this was the source for a lot of people. It's probably been the source for a lot of Nintendo history over the years, and there's a very good reason for it. It does an excellent job of recounting everything. One thing that I found very interesting was how Nintendo viewed Sega and NEC, and how they were more worried about NEC at the time than they were Sega. It was kind of cool to see that, especially since you're getting it from a perspective that I don't normally would, or at least I wouldn't normally get it from. Usually I get the story told from Sega's perspective. I don't hear a lot from Nintendo. I think that has to do with a lot of the books that I've read, though. It did raise a pretty interesting question, though. I wonder how NEC was thinking about this whole thing, because now that I've gotten the Nintendo and I've had the Sega perspective, I don't know how NEC thought about all of this. We do know what their marketing strategy was, which didn't work in the US very well, but we don't really have a lot of information from them on the subject. Or if it's out there, I just haven't gone and looked for it yet. So Game Over is a very Nintendo-centric book, essentially. You do hear a little bit from Sega in this, but for the most part, it's really just Nintendo, which honestly makes a lot more sense when you know the time period that this was written, and Nintendo kind of ruled everything at the time. Well, I found a lot of this stuff pretty interesting, especially when he starts off by going over Nintendo's history. It wasn't anything I hadn't heard before. There were a few more details in here. He elaborates on some stuff that I didn't necessarily know about, but for the most part, I kind of knew what was going on in this book already. So let me just give you a rundown of kind of the different stuff that is kind of covered in here. The first is obviously Donkey Kong. Once we get into Nintendo, of course, there's a lot of talk about the relationships and kind of getting to where they would actually release they would release Donkey Kong. We start off with Radar Scope and how that didn't quite work out. It goes over how Yamauchi tried to get his son-in-law to actually like want to work at Nintendo. There's a lot of talk about that stuff, which it wasn't all that interesting to me, but I guess it could be interesting to other people. Yeah, we go on to how Nintendo set up a lot of their different relationships, how they got their distribution in the US set up and everything, how Donkey Kong came out, the lawsuit between Universal and Nintendo, which Nintendo won. It was a very interesting thing to go through. It was just one of those things, like I've said, I've heard it before. And it was fine. I've just, you hear a story before, you don't necessarily need to hear it again. And then it goes over like the marketing of the NES, that sort of thing, which is, again, it's very interesting. Just you've heard it before. At least most people have. It's still a good story though. They do go a bit more into like the marketing side of things, especially when they get to like once they get the Nintendo rolling and everything like that. You talk a little bit about you hear a little bit about just some of the weird things that they say in here. There are a few times that like video game magazines and stuff like that are brought up where it's very clear that they want to portray the fact that they did it first, which isn't really true. In fact, it's not true at all, but there were just weird things in here like that where I was like, well, it's the first time you did it. It doesn't mean it's the first time it was done. And yeah, you can kind of see some of the weird things where Nintendo might have been trying to portray themselves as being the best when they did these interviews with David. But yeah, some of it's just kind of weird. Most of it's great, but every once in a while there's a weird thing in there. But we do get to my favorite part of this, is when they go over the story of Tetris. And I just love the story of how Tetris came to the US. It's told mostly correct and everything, or at least it was correct at the time. I feel like more information has come out and it's kind of been expanded on because I've read like more detailed accounts of it, especially in the Tetris Effect. That one goes way more in depth on how all of this came together. And I just sort of like that telling a lot more than this one. There's nothing wrong with it. I just feel like they didn't do as good a job as they could have in this. And granted, saying that, it's probably because they just didn't know. David just didn't know everything at the time, and a lot of the facts were still kind of locked behind the Iron Curtain and whatnot. This is the 90s and late 80s, so yeah, not everything could be known. Even in this kind of expanded one, he couldn't possibly have known everything. So yeah, you got some issues where stuff just can't possibly be known yet at the time of David's writing. And so you have some of these books that sort of get into this like single subject more, whereas David just gives you a broad overview. So it was a fun book to read. If you want to know more about Nintendo's history up until the N64, then this is probably a good one for you. Or you can just look at all the videos that kind of use this one as a source and maybe didn't necessarily say it was one of their sources. So that's going to wrap it up, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and have a great day, everyone.